China has, for the first time, cracked the top 20 in a global ranking of the state of innovation around the world. A Global Innovation Index 2018, co-published annually by Cornell University, INSEAD, and the World Intellectual Property Organization on Tuesday, says China has risen 5 places to reach the 17th position since last year. China is also the only middle-income economy to make it into the top 20. What has led to China's rapid advancement in the ranking during the past years? Has the ranking been painting too rosy a picture of China's innovating abilities? And how is the global picture going to look like in terms of innovation in the near future? Welcome to this special edition of The Point with me, Liu Xin, coming to you from Beijing. My guest today is from Geneva, Switzerland, Francis Gurry, Director General of the World Intellectual Property Organization. Mr. Gurry, thank you very much for joining us today. So good news for China, rising 5 places from 22nd last year to 17th this year on the global ranking of 126 economies. Indeed, that's quite impressive. Could you explain to us a bit on what indices, on what criteria was this ranking made?
Yes, indeed. Well, look, it's wonderful to have this opportunity to talk to you again. What we try to do here is to measure innovation capacity and performance. Why do we do that? Well, it's extremely important because innovation is at the center of the world economy now. It's at the center of competition between economies and between enterprises, and it's at the center of our capacity to improve our well-being, our material well-being. We base it on a large number of indicators, around about 80 of them, which measure, first of all, the inputs that go into innovation. For example, education system, the amount invested in research and development, the human resources, the science workers and research and development workers, and we base it also on outputs, what comes out of that process, namely the number of patents, the number of scientific publications, the number of high-tech exports, so all the range of outputs that you would expect from innovation, and overall we consolidate a picture of a country's performance and its capacity to perform.
Well, China has been doing fairly well since recent years. Only a couple of years ago, China made it into the top 25 as the only middle-income economy, and this year it's gone into the top 20, indeed quite impressive, and by 5 places. Were you surprised by this result this year?
Not at all. You know, I think a year-on-year improvement or change is less significant than a trend. And when we see the trend with China, it's an extremely positive trend. And as you know, it has been over the last several years in particular, rising and rising and rising. So we're not surprised to see quite a jump this year from number 22 to number 17. And I think it corresponds entirely with everything that we see about the performance of China in respect of innovation. So we see that this is a top-down driven policy setting, that it's a whole-of-country effort, that there is a response to the strategic direction set by the leadership, by all of the institutions and all of the enterprises in China, and as a consequence we are seeing a structural change, I think, in the Chinese economy, away from, if you like, the labor-intensive factories and more towards the knowledge-intensive laboratories and institutions. And we see that in a wide range of indicators. As you know, China now has moved into 2nd position as a filer of international patent applications under the system run by the World Intellectual Property Organization. It is the 2nd largest investor in research and development. A massive increase in scientific journals, articles coming out of the Chinese universities and research institutions. So whatever indicator you take, you see, I think, a constant and steady rise So this year's performance, which is another remarkable performance, going up 5 places, fits into a trend, and it's a trend that is important, and I think we can say with a certain amount of confidence that we would expect this trend to continue and China's place to continue to rise.
If you are to compare the different models of innovation in the top 20, let's say one that's represented by the United States, which has always done very well in terms of this ranking since 2009, and the model of innovation from China, what are the major differences? Is there a, let's say, this is the right way to do it, or this is the right way to do it? What is your comparison between these two?
Look, it's a very interesting question, and I think what we see is that in the case of the United States of America, of course it's a top performer in innovation, and a lot of innovation is coming out of the United States of America. But they don't have, as it were, and here I quote you know, some leading experts from the National Academies of Science in the United States. It's not really a system in the sense that there is a central direction given to it. It's an ecosystem where there are many, you know, outstanding institutions, tertiary institutions, education, research institutions. There is an overall consensus, I would say, in the United States of America, and has been for a long time, that science, technology and innovation are the basis of their competitive advantage. And that has been the case especially I would say, since the 1950s and since a direction was set with science, the endless frontier. But then you turn to China and you have an entirely different model. It's a more planned model, it's a more systemic model, it's a more leadership-driven model, but one which gets take up right across the country and right across the ecosystem that has developed in China. So two very different models. Both are successful. I think you cannot say that one is right and the other is wrong. And this is an interesting thing to watch, I think, in the coming years.
Well, the reason, I guess you've already figured out, and the reason why I'm asking this question is precisely because China's model of innovation, of advancing itself scientifically and technologically, has been under much criticism by the press in the West, by Western governments, saying, you know, China is copying China is forcing others to transfer technology and so on and so forth. So the reason I'm asking that is the context. Do you have any comments in terms of how China has
well, I would...
Right. Go ahead.
Look, I would say, you know, that those are very selective examples. You know, the effort that goes into building innovation capacity is so vast that to take the two examples that you mentioned, the two allegations, let's say, that you mentioned of copying on the one hand, or on the other hand of forcing technology transfer. These are, if you take the overall context, relatively, I'm sorry to say, but relatively minor incidences in, and it ignores the enormous effort that's gone into the construction of an educational system, the enormous effort that's gone into and careful reflection on the construction of a regulatory system, and providing good institutions that enable the market to function, the enormous efforts in research and development, the investment in research and development, the investment in human resources. These are all huge efforts right across the country, involving, of course, millions and millions of RMB investment and millions of people. So we can't ignore that. We must say that has been successful in the strategic direction of working and gradually acquiring technological capacity and developing that technological capacity, setting directions for investment in artificial intelligence, in robotics, in clean energy, in new technologies, new materials technologies. These are all carefully reflected and thoughtful policies that must be taken extremely seriously. And they can't be reduced to one or two practices or allegations. And I'm not saying anything about those allegations themselves, because that's a matter which I think is under bilateral negotiation and is under some scrutiny at the level, at a multilateral level within the World Trade Organization. But let's take notice that China has arrived as an advanced, technologically advanced economy, and it is a strong, strong competitor on the world scene in advanced technology products and services. That's the reality, and that is why we have a new scene in terms of innovation, and a triangular, as it were, Asia, North America, Europe, with Asia rising very rapidly.
Right. Well, another natural question that arises from this discussion would be how can you compete fairly with China on such a basis when China has a top-down approach, basically the entire country behind industries to innovate, to move forward? How can other countries, how can other groups of companies compete with that? Mr. Gurry, any suggestions?
Yep. Well, look, I think it's really a very interesting world, and it's very interesting to see this. And China's not the only country with a top-down model. I think if you looked at Singapore, which is, of course, a city-state and much different scale, but Singapore has had a top-down level policy, and it's been very successful also. If you look at other examples of models around, we know that in Japan, for example, which is also a very successful performer in innovation, there is a consensus model of discussion and consultation between industry, government and academia or research institutions. So I think there's no absolutely right model. How do others deal with the model of China? Well, I think we can all draw lessons from it. Having a strategic direction is not a bad thing, and having a carefully reflected policy on how you are going to try to structurally transform such a large and diverse economy and move it towards the knowledge-intensive industries, because that's the direction of humanity. That's the direction of the economy. We can see that. And so I would not necessarily say this is a negative thing. This is a very good thing to be able to have that strategic direction that enables individual economic agents to take their cue, to take the strategic directions and to say, okay, we can fit in there, we can go with the, and we see the advantages in it. So I think other countries can actually learn from having strategic directions set at the top level, while still allowing individual actors in the marketplace to choose whether they will or will not follow that direction, and they make that choice at their own peril, really, because there is a direction in the movement of science and technology which is, I'd say, inexorable.
Okay, we're going to take a very short break, and I have been talking to Francis Gurry, the Director General of the World Intellectual Property Organization. When we come back, we're going to talk about whether the latest ranking of the state of innovation in the world has been painting a too rosy picture of China, and what kind of headwinds is China faced with in the near future. Stay with me. Welcome back. My guest is Francis Gurry, the Director General of the World Intellectual Property Organization. Mr. Gurry, some people have been saying, well, China has been doing so well according to your ranking. Is the ranking painting a too rosy picture of China's innovation capabilities? What does that reflect the reality of the things on the ground in China?
Well, the index is taking an impartial, objective look at indicators which are based on empirical data. So I don't think it's too rosy at all. What we see is the result of an analysis and a comparison of data. The rosy picture is a genuine picture, in my view. Now, that's not to say that the task of the structural transformation of such a large, 11 trillion, I think, United States dollars economy, the second largest economy in the world, is not a difficult task to accomplish, and across a huge landmass with huge population and very diverse conditions. It's a massive undertaking, but what we can say is that the results are there in the data, and they are extremely positive. And this is something that we can't ignore, and we can't allow, merely anecdotal or impressionistic views to interfere with what we see as an objective picture.
Let's break down the indices a little bit. For instance, you have multiple indices concerning China's, or concerning all the economies' performances in terms of imports, in terms of market or business sophistication. And for the case of China, it's quite interesting. I noticed that in the past, for instance, from 2016 to 2017, China's performance in market sophistication was actually going down instead of all the other indices, which has been lifting China's ranking in that index. I wonder if there has been any change since then in terms of market sophistication, and whether China can do better in other areas according to your understanding.
Market sophistication, I think, we are all conscious of I think, the fine institutions that exist in China, and the level of sophistication that exists in the business community, whether the state-owned enterprises or privately owned enterprises. That, I think, we have seen some decline, but I think this year's results are more positive in this regard for business sophistication. And I think that we see, with the expansion of the Chinese economy, with the change in the nature of its structure, with the building of many, many relationships with foreign markets and foreign countries, we will see business sophistication as an indicator rise. And it's a very complex matter, of course. It involves financial markets, it involves the way in which products are marketed in foreign markets, and the brand and image and reputation of those markets. We see that rising, I think, in China, and that would not be a particular concern for me.
What would be?
As an observer.
What would be a particular concern for you in terms of China's innovative ability in the near future?
Well, look, I think that we see tendencies in the world towards closure rather than openness. So we've experienced a long period, roughly 20 years, in the latest wave of opening of markets. And China has taken advantage of that, of course, and has been a major exporter, and has created relationships with many foreign markets. Now, to the extent that there are tendencies in the world at the moment, and we all know, we can see this, we can hear, we can read, we see what is happening, towards closure, this, I think, represents a threat to China, because while there is a big effort to increase domestic demand and domestic consumption in China, and that is happening, and that will drive the economy also. At the same time, all economies, really, and all major economies, are reliant on the trade relationships that they build, and the openness of the markets to the reception of their products and services. So I would say this is something that affects, of course, the whole world. It's not just China that is potentially affected by these tendencies to closure, but China in particular will be affected.
In terms of other countries and regions innovating and trying to innovate, are there other aspects or regions or a group of actors that whose performance are worth celebrating? And are there points of concern for you that countries really need to work on?
Yes, absolutely. I think we've spoken a lot about China, we've spoken a lot about Asia, and we've seen the tendencies there, which are all positive. What I think we face in the world as a major challenge is the differences or asymmetries in technological capacity, and this is one of the reasons we undertake this exercise of doing a global innovation index. We, of course, are all enchanted by and concentrate on the top performers, but we should spare time also and reflection for those who are not performing so well. There are enormous differences in the world, and for me personally, my view is that technology is the great differentiator in performance and in well-being of countries around the world. You know, your capacity to the length of average length of life will depend upon the availability of good health technologies. For example, your capacity to enjoy a relatively secure environment will also depend on the degree to which you can deploy technology. So it's really a very fundamental thing, technology, and building technological capacity is an extraordinary, it's a long-term process, and it's an extraordinarily complex process. So when we look at Africa, for example, we see that this is one of the great differentiators between Africa and other regions in the world. And it's a cause of concern for all of us because, first of all, it will affect their economic performance and their capacity to perform and to compete. And secondly, it affects their conditions and their well-being of life. So we all have an interest in seeing countries in Africa building their technological capacity. Now, to some extent that is happening. There are some very good performers. We have a measure called Innovation Achievers, and we see that Sub-Saharan Africa has a number of countries that fit into this category: Rwanda, Kenya, for example, Tanzania, Ghana, and it's very good to see this certainly happening. But when we look at scale, it's a different thing. So what we see is that a number of African economies are very efficient in the process of converting inputs to innovation into outputs. But in terms of scale, it's at a much lower level. And the amount invested, for example, by the United States of America or China in research and development, look, this year I think it's going to be around about 540 billion United States dollars. For the United States, 520 billion, and for China, 420 billion. This is more than the GDP of about 160 countries in the world.
Right. So the gap actually goes bigger.
When we see scale, we see that's, I think, the big danger that we all have to avoid. That the top performers, you know, distance themselves, and that the distance becomes increasingly important.
Right.
And this is a real challenge, and I think, you know, we need as an international community to think about how we can do this. And of course there are many policies, many ways of doing it. Building infrastructure is one way that China has followed. In the Belt and Road Initiative is one example of building the infrastructure that facilitates the trade and facilitates the transfer of information, knowledge, and capacity. So this is a fundamental problem for the world.
Right. Well, very quickly touching upon the theme of this year's index, there is this key word that is energy. The theme of this year is energizing the world through innovation. Why do you want to bring people's attention to the innovation in the energy sector? Very briefly, please.
Well, because the demand for energy is rising, and it will rise by about 30% in the course to about 2040. Now, how are we going to satisfy that? we can just continue to dig out new existing resources until we exhaust them as a world, and we know that that has a negative impact on climate change. Or we can look for technological solutions which will enable us to be more efficient in the production, transmission and storage of energy, and there's such a lot of things that need to happen there and are happening to some extent. And in particular clean energies which will enable us to enjoy a higher quality of life, and also retard, we hope, stop the process of slow the process of climate change. So this is fundamental. It's really fundamental that there is this investment. And quite a worrying trend is that we saw a large increase in investment or in outputs, let's say, in new patents on clean energies up until about 2 or 3 years ago, and 2 or 3 years ago we now see that this is plateaued, it's slowed down. So we all need to be conscious of this, and we need to direct our resources into the production, transmission and storage of clean energies.
Yeah, definitely direct our energies into that sector, into innovation in the energy sector. Many thanks to my guest today, Francis Gurry, Director General of the World Intellectual Property Organization. And my topic today has been that for the first time, China has cracked the top 20 in a global ranking of the state of innovation around the world. Well, that is it for this edition of The Point with me, Li Xin. As always, follow me on Facebook and Twitter using the handle The Point with Alex. Download the application called CGTN to watch the show on your mobile devices, or go to YouTube and look for CGTN The Point. Thanks for watching. You've got The Point.